On 4 Now, the rise and fall of one of New Labour's brightest entrepreneurs, the real Peter Mandelson.
I am very sorry that your meeting ended as it did, but I think we have to recognize that you and I have reached the end of the road.
Just 3 years ago, at the height of his influence in New Labour, Peter Mandelson wrote this letter of resignation to Tony Blair. Though presumed to be glacially calculating, he has often shown a volatile side to his character. This is the story of the two sides of Peter Mandelson and of one man's often unrequited love affair with the Labour Party.
The ice cap Mandelson exists because he is over-aware of an underlying sensitivity.
Brilliant, slightly tormented, very misunderstood.
Never fazed by anything or anybody.
This middle-aged carefulness, this neatness, set against an incredible impulsiveness when the occasion took him, a recklessness.
He's like our version of Eric Cantona, really. He's reading poetry when the other lads are in the bar having a beer.
People say about Peter that he's sort of Machiavellian, the Prince of Darkness, but I've always thought that there's one character he really reminds me of, it's Jeeves in the Bertie Wooster stories, because he sort of shimmers into the room, and it would be, do you really think so, that tie?
Jeeves, perhaps, but with a darkly mysterious ability to cast a spell. We asked one of Tony Blair's team to describe the undercover role Mandelson once performed for him under the codename Bobby.
I was the runner in the office, so I kind of generally answered the phones and did all the crap, basically. God, it's like a poltergeist. It's like saying the name Bobby and it all kind of comes crumbling down. The red roses leap out of the vase and go, no, it didn't exist.
Peter Mandelson is a linchpin figure in the creation of New Labour, the idea that now dominates the British political landscape. I've been researching his biography for the past 18 months, talking to people who've been close to him, and trying to unravel the Mandelson enigma. The story starts here, in Hampstead Garden suburb, where Mandelson was born on October the 21st, 1953. The contrasts in Peter Mandelson may have their origin in the very different characteristics he inherited from his parents.
I think in many respects my brother took after my father, certainly in terms of charm, gregariousness, self-confidence, sheer cheek. And yet, having said that, I think Peter has inherited some of my mother's traits as well. Punctiliousness, the attention to detail, the getting it right and not tolerating half measures or jobs half done.
Quiet, elegant, gracious, softly spoken, but with tremendous steel. If you incurred my mother's disapproval, you would know it.
Mr. Herbert Morrison, the new Minister of Home Security, and Admiral Sir Edward Evans make a tour of East London shelters.
Mandelson was born into the Labour Party. His grandfather, Herbert Morrison, was one of the big Labour figures of the era, a senior minister in both the wartime coalition and in Attlee's post-war government. Mandelson sees the link as significant.
I think from a very early age, I quickly became my grandfather's grandson.
But Morrison was actually quite a remote figure. After his second marriage, when Peter was just 2, the family saw little of him.
My brother's impression of Herbert was as much through stories he heard, books he read, things he saw on the television. as they were through any direct contact that he had with him.
Another Labour grandee loomed large in Mandelson's childhood. He watched close neighbours Harold and Mary Wilson leaving for Downing Street after the 1964 election victory. A year later, the two Mandelson boys were invited to a family party inside number 10. The child Mandelson, like his adult self, was both very much liked and just a little feared.
He commanded great affection and great loyalty from his friends. I think many of them were always slightly intimidated by him, and there are times when I feel intimidated by him.
The family were fans of the radio programme Round the Horn.
Now, a story of the fastest gun in the West, and how justice was brought to the wild frontier by the man they called the Lone Ranger. My name is Wild Alf Pubes.
Miles invented a character for his brother in the style of the show. Peter revelled in it.
Well, Sir Oswald Smith was basically a fixer, you know, Mr. Fix-It, the wheeler dealer, the cool operator, and that was him.
His school reports revealed two sides of the teenage Mandelson, at once idealistic and rather intolerant. His headmaster saw him undertaking some great task on behalf of humanity. But he became a rebel. His closest friend at Hendon County Grammar was Steve Howell. The two boys organised a revolt against the school's prefect system, during which they led the prefects in a mass resignation.
Well, after we'd all resigned, a few weeks later or a few days later, they appointed some replacement prefects to fill our shoes. And during the breaks, if any of them were walking along this corridor above the playground, then the children down below would be chanting "scab, scab, scab" and whistling at them and booing and all that sort of thing. And they had a pretty hard time of it, actually, right up to the time when the prefect system was finally abolished. And I can clearly remember coming into this classroom, and Peter was always sort of with a small group. He was kind of entertaining, if you like. And one of the girls was sort of teasing Peter about, you know, you'll be Prime Minister one day. And Peter was sort of laughing it off.
And the fact that people slightly gathered round him, is that right?
Yes, he did. He did have a sort of a certain degree of magnetism in a certain section of the school. He wasn't by any means one of the lads. I was much more sort of sporty and very much very laddish, and probably less mature than he was. In fact, I can clearly remember Peter standing by this radiator during break times, chatting to teachers, which is something that other people in the 4th and 5th year would simply never do.
Just as his mother and his grandfather had in their youth, Mandelson embarked on a flirtation with far-left politics. Howell and Mandelson joined the Young Communist League.
Peter and I would go up to Kilburn tube station, which at that time on a Friday night was a fairly rough and ready place, and hand out leaflets, sell papers. Sometimes someone would stand up and make a speech. Peter and I standing there, two young middle-class school kids selling the Morning Star, must have been a curious sight.
We revealed his past identity to those working the same beat 30 years later.
Mandelson. That's utterly astonishing. Anyone of his type could even think about selling the Morning Star. Look what he's become. That was the last person I thought of.
This was the 60s. What, I mean, were the big rock bands Peter's favourites?
I don't remember Peter being into rock bands at all. Andy Williams. wasn't
he was
a
an Andy
real,
Williams fan.
He was an Andy Williams fan, yes. He would sing Moon River and things like that. He had quite a good voice, actually, if you like that kind of thing.
You dream maker, you heartbreaker, wherever you're going, I'm going your way.
Perhaps unusually, Mandelson did translate his youthful idealism into something of practical worth. A youth club in Swiss Cottage owes much to the Prince of Darkness.
Well, apart from getting stuck in and clearing the building of rubbish and getting covered in dirt and really helping out, he also had a very sort of acute political mind already about how to get public support for the project.
Graham Good, then homeless, even stayed at the Mandelsons for a year. Peter's father, Tony, became the project's benefactor. The practical side to the young Mandelson's idealism took him to Africa after he left school. For a year, he worked for church aid projects in Tanzania, then under the rule of the socialist Julius Nyerere. His introspective letters home to Steve Howell show him ready to abandon communism in favour of mainstream Labour politics.
He says, sometimes I feel that I'm retaining the force and commitment of my YCL-bred attitudes and beliefs, but I'm just not having the opportunity to expound them or act on them. And other times I feel that my revolutionary ardour is fading because I'm a bourgeois at heart, and that people whose company I enjoy most are those from a strictly bourgeois and intellectual background, and that the life I enjoy most doesn't exactly revolve around the class struggle. He says later on in the letter, sometimes I reason that Tanzanian socialism is tremendous and is the only hope for development, but that socialism in England would be wholly impracticable, and that we're living in an ideological cloud cuckoo land in which England no more has a socialist future than a fly in the air.
It's quite prophetic.
After Oxford University, Mandelson went to work for the TUC and became chairman of the British Youth Council. In 1978, the council attended the World Festival of Youth in Havana. The festival was communist-dominated, and the British team went to stand up for democracy. Now 24, Mandelson road-tested his future role as right-hand man to the leader.
I was the one who handled the big meetings. I bullied the delegation, in public sense, into taking the right position. Peter, however, his job was behind the scenes, making sure that the resolutions and all of the rest of it came out right. And he would come along and say to me, okay, what we've got to do is to get through resolution that says X. And I would go on the platform in front of the delegation of whatever it is, 170, 180 people, and I would say, this is what we're going to do, guys.
While other delegates partied, Mandelson showed impressive discipline.
After the day was over, he would go off to bed to prepare for the next day. We were sharing a room at this time, and I would go off and party. And I would then show up at 6 o'clock in the morning in our room. He'd just be waking up, I'd be crashing out, and he'd look at me pityingly as if I'd sort of, you know, you don't take this seriously at all, do you? He'd say.
Back home, Mandelson set out on a career within the Labour Party. He became a councillor in Lambeth and a researcher for Labour's shadow transport team. But there was another side to this rather serious young politician in the making.
But on a one-to-one basis or in a small group, he had the capacity of absolutely being the centre of attention and making you want to belong to the gang that he belonged to be the recipient of all that gossip, all those malicious witticisms, those ways he had of characterising, giving nicknames to people. An absolutely brilliant way of reducing people to their essential nickname. And you always had a slight fear that he was going to do it to you, whilst enjoying enormously the fact that he did it to other people.
In 1982, at the age of 28, he went to work for London Weekend Television, putting his political career on hold as Labour fell increasingly under the influence of the left.
Hello and good afternoon. Today, Weekend World looks at the mood of the nation.
They don't make programmes like Weekend World anymore. Weekend World was a programme that took no hostages, made no concessions to the pleasure of the viewer, but went straight for what it thought was the intellectual heart of the big question.
Weekend World commissioned a series of opinion surveys. There were 3 of them.
One edition of Weekend World, produced by Peter Mandelson, rather doggedly pursued the question of what voters really wanted from political parties.
The unsentimental, analytical approach that he was asked to take when he was looking at problems for a television programme was exactly what he needed to set on one side all the old ideas about the Labour Party which were holding back other people in the party itself who were looking at the same problems.
Many floaters continued to be alarmed by Labour's relationship with the trade unions, which they feel dominate the party.
But with reform beginning under Neil Kinnock, Mandelson was ready to try and turn his analysis of how Labour had to change into reality.
Here's my tie street.
Good morning and welcome. We're here on the lawn with the President's speech. We anticipate
Good morning. Excuse me, I was wondering if you could tell me about these screens.
What?
No, just sort of roughly what they're made of.
They're polycarbonate. Bulletproof.
I gather some people came here for a closer look at the stuff.
We wouldn't know about that. Anyhow, we're not authorized to give that sort of information.
It's just that someone said that these people could be using the same material to make car headlights.
Are you from the Bureau or something?
No.
Well, I don't know what you mean. This stuff is designed to protect the president. Why would anyone want to use it in headlights?
That's crazy to me. This is a restricted area.
I was just trying to find out. Sorry.
Shut the camera off.
I think for too long the Labour Party has viewed television as our persecutor. Well, I want to use television as our tool, as our servant.
Mandelson applied for the job of Director of Communications at the Labour Party, with a plan to reform the party's image and a reference from John Prescott. Ominously for journalists, he wrote that no slanted reporting should pass without our complaining persistently and to high levels if necessary. Only his appearance did not quite show the meticulousness that would subsequently become his trademark.
And I looked down because you could see under the table. I was sitting not quite directly opposite him, and he had powder blue socks on and his shoes hadn't been polished. And I did recall that. Both Hattersley and I coming, of course, from the regimental school of politics, in which if you turned up with shoes that were less than shining, there was a question about your character.
The interview committee was evenly split between the candidates of right and left, until Neil Kinnock drew on the personal loyalty of 2 members of the left caucus.
I wanted to steer from Neil about what he wanted, so I sent him a note. I wrote Mandelson and sent it back. We thought about this very carefully. We weren't anxious to incur the wrath of the left slate, but on the other hand, we wanted Neil to have the team that he wanted to win the election, so we both switched.
Mandelson arrived at the Labour Party convinced it needed to ditch many of its left-wing policies to win power. He saw in Neil Kinnock a leader with the courage to do just that, and he devoted himself to helping him.
He'd formed a picture of what his task for the day was before most of us had actually sort of finished dressing and had breakfast. And he was constantly whizzing between Walworth Road, Westminster. That would just go on through the day, spending time with people, talking to people, up in the press gallery, usually ending up, in Kinnock's office, 9, 10 o'clock at night, late night curry takeaways. God knows when he ever got to bed.
He also built a relationship with a party leader that nobody in that job had ever had before. Peter went straight for the top and became indispensable to Neil Kinnock. He offered a whole way of redesigning the Labour Party, and a party leader couldn't really say no to that.
We've introduced a new campaigning emblem for the party,
an emblem which expresses the new vigour, the new confidence of the party.
Mandelson made the leader central to the party's appeal.
It's the modern techniques, the effective techniques that we've reintroduced to the Labour Party, and which are what my job is all about.
Labour's journey away from the left was to be forcibly impressed on journalists.
If you went along with what Peter wants, and in the 80s it was primarily the way the party was changing, and he used the newspapers as a vehicle to change the party, then you were part of the favoured group.
If he gave someone a briefing and they wrote exactly as he briefed, without deviation or contradiction, for the next few days, other editors of other papers would get a call from Peter saying, could I draw your attention to the very, very accurate and very insightful report by so-and-so, such and such a paper. So this person would have his reputation sort of lauded throughout Fleet Street for doing as he was told.
If you didn't go along with it, then
you would literally be sent to Siberia in terms of getting information.
Peter was watching this broadcast.
Running now, ready when you are.
And as it was going on, he picked up the phone and rang the Sky's editor. And so as soon as he came off,
Peter Allen, ITN, Walworth Road.
Contacted headquarters to see how he'd done. He had relayed back to him the fact that there had been a complaint about what he said. Now, it was too late to do anything about it because it was a live report, but he said that from there on he was always wary. He always knew he had to be careful because Mandelson might be listening and Mandelson might tell his bosses.
Now, there were occasions during the campaign when I felt I had to make an informal representation to the broadcasters about the treatment of the Labour Party and the treatment of our campaign, in particular news bulletins. But that was always conducted in a polite and civilised way.
At the 1988 Labour conference, Mandelson provided a textbook example of how to exercise control over the media.
88 was significant because Neil Kinnock and Roy Hattersley were being elected leader and deputy leader to acclaim, and therefore the modernisation of the party could proceed. What Peter wanted was for that very upbeat message to be the message that came over on the bulletins before party conference. What I had done was take it to the next stage. What is the next step in transformation? And it was to abolish the block vote, the trade union block vote.
The report was to be delivered from the conference set.
I asked Peter, being the polite person that I am, could we have permission to do the piece to camera on the set, because I know, he doesn't usually like this. And he said, oh, fine, yes, that's great. What are you going to be saying? And myself, as a fool, actually, I told him what we were going to say. And when he heard this, he screamed on the end of the phone, get off my set, you're not allowed on my set. The editor took the phone from me while I was talking to Peter, because he could obviously tell that this was a fraught conversation that was going on. And Peter would have told him, if you want this week to go smoothly, i.e. you want access, you want interviews, you want information, then you've got to do the story I want.
Neil Kinnock will be arriving here at the conference hotel shortly. His supporters are already celebrating. They say his certain overwhelming victory in tomorrow's election is proof that he has a mandate to modernise the party. Julie Hall, ITN, Blackpool.
It was absolutely fantastic. Peter got exactly what he wanted. Julie ended her piece to come on a very upbeat note, and Peter got the conference off to a flying start.
I do remember that. And I do remember that the action had been taken, and then it was checked with me. And to put it colloquially, I said, that's right, sod 'em. If they want entertainment, they can buy a ticket to the circus. And so I entirely agreed with that. I suppose I could have countermanded it if I didn't agree with it, but I did.
Mandelson had a mission to demolish Labour's image as a party dominated by the unions and the left, and he took risks to achieve it.
He cut through a lot of red tape and old-fashioned structures to get what he wanted to do done, and I think he alienated people by doing that. So he was a high-wire act, he was a risk, and he took the risk and eventually he paid the price.
Peter was doing what the leadership wanted, and what they should really have been doing is attacking the leader or the leadership, but it was easier to attack Peter, and therefore Peter, time and again, drew the attack upon himself because he was a much easier target.
Mandelson's approach did aggravate some powerful figures.
And now I've read it in the paper, I can tell you what actually happened. Because I was sworn to secrecy. You know, the new 30-year secrecy rule, the Mandelson rule. The one where you're sworn to secrecy and banned from saying anything critical about party or colleagues for 30 years. Unless, of course, you're Peter Mandelson and it's off the record.
The antipathy towards Mandelson as a middle-class metropolitan gave rise to one of the most enduring Mandelson myths.
You contribute to it.
It was born in 1985 at the Brecon by-election.
I think I am the originator of the mushy peas story. I made up this story that he'd gone into this very broad Welsh chip shop in the middle of Brecon and said that he'd like a 6 and a fish, and could I have some of that guacamole dip, please? And he took it in very good part.
Unreciprocated though it may have been, Mandelson has always shown unusual devotion to the Labour Party. Even close friends could be sent to Siberia on its behalf.
After the '92 election, I and others who were fond of Neil felt very bitter about the way that very quickly Neil was being pushed aside by people who wanted to promote John Smith's leadership, John Smith's role in the general election campaign, etc. For once in my life, without consulting people like Peter or Tony or Gordon, I sat down at my computer and I wrote a half-page letter to The Guardian, which basically was out of anger and sadness for the way Neil was being just shoved to one side.
Mandelson was furious at the divisive message this letter conveyed.
Peter refused to speak to me for 3 months after that. This was a guy who I'd only recently been sharing a flat with. He simply refused to speak to me.
The one time that Peter and I have ever fallen out, and it was quite a serious falling out, and it took quite a long time to recover, was over the issue of Red Wedge.
Red Wedge was a collection of 80s pop musicians who pledged to help build support for Labour.
Party that became so powerful by sinking foreign boats, dreaming up new promises, 'cause promises win votes.
I was pretty sceptical about this, and I said to him over this dinner, look, these guys are musicians. You can't trust them. You know, they will be with you as long as the anti-Thatcher thing is popular, but then they'll buzz off. They don't really support Kinnock. And he really bridled at this, and we got into a row. He left prematurely, let's put it that way. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a walkout, but he was very, very pissed off with me. The fact is that what he hated was the idea that one would criticise the Labour Party.
And being resolute in conference with the ad man's expertise.
That is his religion. And I had almost, in a way, as if I'd gone into the Vatican and said to the Pope, do you know Catholics really don't follow your teachings on birth control? I'd offended him that much.
Mandelson's ruthless side hid a vulnerable aspect to his personality. By the 1987 election, he'd been living with his male partner for several years. He has never hidden his homosexuality from people he's known.
When I knew Peter, I never knew him to be anything other than completely open about what he was sexually. There was no attempt to hide it. There was no sense of shame about who and what he was, any more than there was about any of the rest of us.
We were well aware of Peter's sexuality. It was never an issue, never a subject that any of us discussed, not something that mattered.
Mandelson, however, was deeply bruised when the News of the World ran a typically lurid story about his relationship in the middle of the '87 election campaign.
The atmosphere in the press office wasn't too good, The phone was ringing continually, and this was the man from News of the World who wanted to speak to Peter Mandelson, who didn't want to talk to him. And it was just all rather bad for everybody, because it was as if the enemy had successfully invaded our camp and was in there controlling events. So I took this call from him and told him that, very well, if he wanted to interview Peter, he could come round and do it in the office. And we would call in the BBC and ITV, and the whole nation would see him at work. At that, he put the phone down on me, which was probably just as well, because I had no agreement with Peter that he was going to be interviewed like this.
He was very deeply wounded, and full of remorse for the sake of the strength of the campaign.
During all the time I worked with him, it was the only thing that only time he ever showed a sign of not being able to control and cope with what was happening.
He was my friend as well as a fellow worker in the cause. So I did what anybody would do in those circumstances and gave him complete reassurance.
Mandelson did his most important work for Neil Kinnock in the 2 years after the '87 election defeat, helping him to junk unpopular commitments on nationalisation and defence. Then he faced a choice. He wanted a seat in Parliament, but that would mean abandoning his role with Kinnock.
I didn't want that team broken up with the departure of anybody, and I let him know. He was determined to do it. He gave me a number of reasons for doing it. He thought that this is something he had to try, but I did regret the fact that the team had been slightly fractured, that's for certain.
By this time, Mandelson had friends in the north. Another determined young politician, Tony Blair, had won the safe Labour seat of Sedgefield in 1983 when one of the most prominent members of his local party stood aside for him. In 1989, the same man saw an opening in neighbouring Hartlepool.
I thought this is round about the last chance, because I don't believe in going on till 70s and 80s and things like this. So I was thinking about it, and I said to Tony, I said, Hartlepool's coming up. I said, I don't know whether I would go at Hartlepool. And he said, oh, actually, he said, there's a friend of mine, he said, you met him, Peter, who I would, you know, I think he's interested. So if Peter was interested, that was good enough for me, really. We'd put Tony in, and it would be nice to put another star in as well.
Some taste of success.
Blair was one of two like-minded rising young stars with whom Mandelson had by now formed a very close bond. The other, and at this stage the dominant figure, was Gordon Brown. Mandelson had spotted their potential before the '87 election and had used his position as head of communications to promote them.
You've got to remember about the kind of Blair, Brown, Mandelson axis that Peter, in a sense, was senior of the three. He'd been round the course with Neil Kinnock when both Tony and Gordon were up-and-coming men.
Hello, hello. How are you? I'm Peter Mandelson, standing for Labour for Parliament. How are you going to vote, Adam? He's a Labour man. Look at that smile. He saw me and there's a broad smile.
When Mandelson fought Hartlepool in 1992, he was poised to emerge as a politician in his own right, and his links with Brown and Blair meant his long-term future looked in good shape.
There's a face on the front, like that, and words on the back. That's my letter. You a Labour puppy? If there's anything I can do for you or your family, I'll be working full-time for the town after the election, so you let me know.
Peter Benjamin Mandelson has been duly appointed to serve as member for the constituency of Hartlepool.
But the harmony between the three modernisers would before long be broken apart.
Did you ever have a dream you just couldn't forget?
There's a town covered in water. Someone left him in it.
Did you ever meet someone
I'm dreaming about him.
you couldn't get out of your head?
Get out of my brain. Get out of my brain.
Annette Bening, Aidan Quinn, and Robert Downey Jr. in Dreams.
Wouldn't you like to change gear at the touch of a button? Now you can.
Alpha 156 cellar speed, the first production saloon car with sequential transmission control on the steering wheel. From 21,993 pounds, Alpha 156 cellar speed.
Air Canada has comfortable seats, plenty of personal space, and more lost bags.
Defy fatigue.
Despite full medical attention to Mr. Smith, he was pronounced dead at 9:15 on the 12th of May.
Mandelson had been out of favour during the Smith years. Smith's death propelled him back to the centre of affairs, but it also triggered a crisis. The crucial 5 days after John Smith's death caused a rupture at the heart of New Labour. Peter Mandelson is accused during this period of the darkest political treachery. Essentially, the charge is that he eased Gordon Brown aside for the leadership in favour of Tony Blair, whom he'd come to prefer. So did Mandelson, as accused, knife Brown in the back on behalf of Tony Blair?
I was with him on the day that John Smith died. I walked over with him to the House of Commons where he met Tony.
Mandelson did meet Blair in secret in the division lobbies of the House of Commons on the afternoon of Smith's death. Blair had already decided to stand, but Mandelson is adamant that he did not throw in his lot with Blair at this stage.
I then drove him back to his flat, and because he was so shook up, I slept on the sofa bed that night and got up the next morning where he was still unsure about what to do and, you know, mortified really at what had happened. And we got in the car and drove down, and, you know, he was looking at the newspapers, deep in thought, and I turned to him and said, "You don't get the front runner standing down, do you?" And he looked at me and said, "Well, no, I don't suppose you do."
But did Mandelson engineer a momentum behind Blair on that Friday? I was a parliamentary lobby journalist at that time. With me and others, he rather painstakingly talked up Brown's chances. I have not found one journalist who Mandelson briefed at this stage in favour of Blair rather than Brown. What is clear is that by the end of that Friday, the momentum behind Blair needed no help from Mandelson or anyone else. But the next day, he was to make an intervention that Brown's camp read as a clear move for Blair. Appearing on Channel 4, he named 4 contenders, possibly in order of preference.
Can I just make another point? I judge from your questions that you imagine that there is rather more than divides Tony Blair, for example, or Gordon Brown, Robin Cook, or John Prescott, than unites them. I think you're wrong.
He then explained how he thought Brown and Blair would decide which one of the two went forward.
They would want to consider who would be best fitted to lead the Labour Party, who would maximise support for the party in the country. And if every contender considered that, I mean, who is best, who will play best at the box office, who will not simply appeal to the traditional supporters and customers of the Labour Party, but who will bring in those extra additional voters that we need in order to win convincingly at the next election. That's what each contender has got to ask themselves before they put themselves forward.
Was this a coded signal for Blair, or did Mandelson's phrases apply equally to Brown? On the Monday, Mandelson faxed Brown a letter which his opponents see as evidence of his treachery.
Ultimately, the card the media are playing for Tony is his southern appeal. He doesn't need to point it out or build it up. My fear is that drift is harming you. You either have to escalate rapidly, or you need to implement a strategy to withdraw with enhanced position, strength and respect. Will you let me know your wishes? Peter.
Mandelson's friends see this letter as frank and constructive.
It doesn't seem to me this is an act of rank treachery, but simply shrewd and honest political advice. But he's never been forgiven for it, and I think he's become a convenient scapegoat. It's as if psychologically, I don't know whether Gordon Brown himself, but some of the people around Gordon Brown cannot accept the fact that in a straight fight, fair and square, Tony Blair would have won, and they have to find some other reason, some Machiavel, some devil that robbed them.
5 years on, it's still very hard to say exactly what Peter Mandelson's innermost thoughts and motivations were at this point. I think he probably did realise pretty early on that Tony Blair was going to be leader of the Labour Party, but that this thought disturbed him because of his very close friendship with Gordon Brown, and he fought it. But to imagine that he created the momentum which built up round Tony Blair, almost from the moment that John Smith had died, is, I think, to underestimate probably that conflict of loyalty, and certainly to overestimate his power to influence events. But the consequences of those few days would play themselves out inexorably over the next few years. Once Blair was leader, Mandelson became as indispensable to him as he had been to Neil Kinnock.
I cannot think of a situation where Tony Blair, when he wanted proper advice about something, or something was going wrong, wouldn't pick up the phone and talk to Peter.
He was a troubleshooter who would fly above the office like a sort of helicopter. When there was a problem, he would fly down, sort it out, and fly out again.
If there was a few eggs to break, Peter would break the eggs, whereas Tony would tread a little more gently.
In September that year, Mandelson and Brown fell out at a strategy meeting at a country hotel in Hampshire. Brown put forward plans for changes in personnel at Labour's headquarters. To his considerable chagrin, Mandelson declined to back him.
I think Peter would say it was probably the night that where the relationship really did break down. And he did that because rather than just say, you know, yeah, Gordon, I think you've got a point, and then afterwards ring up Tony and say, well, actually, I don't think he's right about that. He wouldn't do it, right? And funnily enough, when he discussed this with Tony afterwards, Tony said, you know, you should have just given Gordon that. You should have just said, you know, you should have just... You know, because, and that is why Tony Blair is Prime Minister and Peter Mandelson probably never will be.
Over the next 2 years, Blair was continually frustrated by the mutual antagonism between his two closest colleagues. Brown seemed to Mandelson to resent his influence. Mandelson was unable to contain his anger at Brown's resentment. In May 1996, Mandelson abruptly left a meeting in Blair's office in the House of Commons, feeling that Blair had allowed Brown to override him unfairly. From Labour's headquarters on the river, he wrote to Blair to resign as his advisor.
We have to recognise that you and I have reached the end of the road. I am more than willing to carry on the general election planning if you wish, although we'll reach the same brick wall on that too eventually. I hope you don't think that amor propria is the root of my problem. I have long gone beyond that. But I felt greatly let down by you this morning and embarrassed. I do not want to be in that position again.
Leaving this letter behind him, he flew to a meeting in Prague. That weekend, another Mandelson asserted itself.
We were wandering around by the river, and then we suddenly heard some disco noise coming from a place, and Peter said, with great sort of leadership qualities, well, we'll go in there then, and I thought, I've no idea what this place is. Well, he's an absolutely marvellous dancer. And since then, people have said to me, oh, you know, I've seen Peter dance as well, and I think, not the way he danced in Prague, you haven't seen him dance.
On his return from Prague, Mandelson received Blair's reply to his letter. Blair acknowledged that it could be difficult to work with Gordon Brown, but he made it clear that it was up to Mandelson to overcome those difficulties. If he didn't, he would have to accept his resignation. Mandelson wrote back,
As a result of the situation with Gordon, I am losing your support. My career is being hampered, I'm getting harmful publicity, and I'm creating further enemies for myself. Nobody, you included I suspect, thinks Gordon is going to change, and therefore, as the number 2, I have to go.
But Blair got his way. Mandelson relented, and remarkably, the tensions didn't hamper Labour's election campaign, on which Brown and Mandelson worked together. For Mandelson, his role in delivering victory as campaign manager had a special significance.
I remember saying to him, well, congratulations and so on, and I stuck in my mind that he said, it looks as though this might be as big an election victory as the landslide my grandfather delivered for Clement Attlee. And I thought it was odd that at that moment he was thinking about his grandfather.
But even in this moment of triumph, he seemed curiously alone, like a stage manager watching the curtain call from the wings.
I went into Millbank and it was a ghost town really. There was no one there at all. All the desks had been left from the night before, you know, the computer screens were still on and there were like half bottles of beer all over the place. And in the middle of the entire desolate room was Peter, just sitting at a desk, kind of staring into space. And I said, what are you doing now? He said, oh, I don't know. And I said, well, you know, I think you should go home to go to sleep. I think that's the best thing you can do. He said, no, I can't. I'm going to wait here until he gets to number 10. I'm not going to go home. So he sat at his desk, well, on his sofa, until he was in number 10, and then he went home to bed.
After the election, Blair again used Mandelson as his troubleshooter, appointing him as Minister without portfolio in charge of the coordination and presentation of policy. The only job he had in his own right was the Dome. Mandelson remained close to Tony Blair, separated only by the inside door between the Cabinet Office and 10 Downing Street.
The fact that the door is there represents the fact that number 10 is a different office from the Cabinet Office, and Peter and I were in the Cabinet Office, and the Prime Minister's personal staff, who are all the people who are really in number 10, were the other side of that door. And it's best remembered from that wonderful episode of Yes, Prime Minister, when called the key, when the lock is changed on the door to stop Sir Humphrey coming through the whole time.
Oh, well, look, it's Humphrey.
Oh, Peter had a key, yes, and he could go through whenever he wanted.
But Mandelson hankered after being his own man.
Peter always knew that he had a personal dilemma. He was very close to the Prime Minister, and if you're close to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister says he needs you in a central role, particularly when you come newly into government, you can't cavil at that. But he knew that his own political career wouldn't flourish until he went out and had experience on his own in a department.
Congratulations, Mr. Mandelson. Are you pleased with that?
With his appointment as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Mandelson finally had the chance to show his mettle as a minister.
It was a very good choice, not only to put him in the cabinet, but also, given his very good links with British business and the trust they had in him, that he should go in for that particular job.
He is an entrepreneur. He is a man who takes risks, and that's what business is often about. They are the kind of people that would respond to Peter Mandelson, and he'd be a man who wanted to get things done, and he did.
Can I say how nice...
In office, he became a potent symbol of Tony Blair's commitment to bring business into the fold.
But I've become a revolutionary. Now, don't worry, not a Marxist revolutionary, but a modern, industrial revolutionary.
But my view was that he was becoming a very successful minister.
But after only 5 months in the cabinet, he was brought down by a reckless act committed 3 years before. He had borrowed £373,000 from fellow MP Geoffrey Robinson to buy a house. He had neglected to tell either his civil servants or Tony Blair or his closest friends.
I remember him saying, did I ever tell you about this loan? And I remember saying, no, you bloody well didn't. You know, he acknowledged that it had been, you know, just a stupid error. I mean, he hadn't realised that it would grow to these proportions.
The consequences of the loan becoming public had long been clear to his young advisor, whose solicitor father handled the loan.
I had known about the loan for some time and thought that were it to become public, there would be a lot of pressure on Peter to resign, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because the newspapers would put a certain construction on it, which would not look good for him, and which would make it difficult for him to stay in government. And I had thought all the way along that if it were to become public, he would probably have to resign.
Mandelson's resignation was the culmination of a second bout of frenzied media interest in his personal life.
He was, in the period before the revelation was made, was worried about his private life. There'd been the Matthew Paris incident on Newsnight.
Just a few words by a journalist in a live broadcast broke the taboo around Mandelson's sexuality. Paris's sudden revelation seemed to discommode a presenter of legendary sang-froid.
There are 2 gay members in the cabinet, at least.
2 gay members of the openly gay members of the cabinet?
Well, Chris Smith is openly gay,
Chris Smith is openly gay.
Peter Mandelson is certainly gay.
Yeah, I think we'll just move on from there. I'm not quite sure where he is on that.
I think that was what he was focusing on. He was focused on that aspect. Actually, nobody cares about sexuality in politics anymore. They do, oddly enough, care about money. And he followed the wrong bull. He was caught on the wrong thing to worry about.
Mandelson's career has been a high-wire act. Politically, it paid off handsomely for Blair and New Labour. Personally, it was his undoing. He could yet decide that he's done his job for the Labour Party, that he has too many enemies, that life outside politics would be more rewarding than a slow climb back to the top.
There's been talk about whether he'll stay in politics or, whether he'll leave, and I don't know what will come of all that. But it's only a small segment in a man's life to say for 2 years really concentrate on doing the nuts and bolts of the job, and then, that you can flower again. And I think he'd be better off for it.
Right now, he does seem committed to rebuilding his political career and winning the party round.
And many people at that time walked away from the Labour Party in those dog days in the early 1980s. But I did not. And I fought the media, and I've lost a few battles with them. But I'm too long in the tooth to stop fighting now. And I'm not going to do so to our party.
He will come back, but he will work his way back, because one of the reflections he will make is that if he's going to return and do it credibly, it's got to be because people recognize that Peter Mandelson is made of good stuff.
If he is able to apply to his own situation the cool strategic approach he has so often taken to the Labour Party, it's unlikely that we've seen the last of him.
New Labour, new theme night. Oh, God. Channel 4's political weekend. And I mean, there's just so much for me to choose from. There's If John Smith Had Lived, which considers what might have been had history taken a different turn and John Smith hadn't passed away. Still, you can't blame us for what happened under the Conservatives. Who you can blame, however, may be revealed in The Trial of Margaret Thatcher, a metaphorical judgment, sadly. Then there's In the Court of King Tony. Come on, that's a bit far-fetched, at least until the second term. All followed by political comedy from Rory Bremner. Well, at least that's my impression. And that's all on the political weekend here on Channel 4. Good, isn't it? Anyone want to buy it?